you a story of a trauma I bear. It was 2 years ago when I gave a lecture in Florence. And it was in a big church, and the bama, the stage, was like 10 meters from the audience. And I was the last speaker of the day. And in my session, the first 2 lectures were not stopped. And the 2 male lecturers were speaking for like 90 minutes each. And by the time it was my turn to speak, I was left alone with only 2 people in the crowd, my very good friends, Tom Segev from the writer at the paper, and the late David Cesarani, who is was a very good English historian. And then he started, to introduce me. And I said, you don't have to do that. I know myself so well for so many years, and so do my friends, but I kept it as a trauma for many years, being alone on the stage, wanting to say something of meaning, and I said, let's do it, cut it short. Tom Segev and David knows what I speak. And that was the thing. And another thing that I want to say, because I guess the presentation is already on, is that I had actually not gone into research of the Vilnius Jews. This is not my background, although you might think from my name, Jablonka, that I'm from Polish origin. It's not. It's a name I got after I married the Jablonka. And I'm actually from the in Israel, it's a kind of a protagonist of the Polish Jews, the Hungarian Jews. My parents came from what was the great Republic of Czechoslovakia. So they are probably from Central and Eastern Europe. They came from the only democracy between the 2 world wars. So I grew up in a very open house, which you will trace in a second in what I have to say. So I was approached by Tzila, and later on I met Hanna. And I gave a very fair exposure that I have nothing to do with the Lithuanian Jews. And then when they said that I can contribute to this event, which I'm willing very much to do, I started to look for my connections with Vilnius Jews. And of course, immediately I found it. And it was so obvious, it was on the table. It was Yitzhak Zuckerman. And I have to say, what is my connection to the building of memorial sites? I am, for the last 17 years, the historian of the Ghetto Fighters Museum, which is probably not known to many of you, but it's the first ever Holocaust museum, and you will see its frame of reference in a second. I'm also the chair of the Hungarian-speaking Heritage Museum in Sfat. They all have something in common, and I was very active in the creation of the Jewish Museum in Slovakia, which has, of course, some resemblance of the procedures that are going on here, and I will speak very briefly, mostly about the Ghetto Fighters Museum, but also about these 2, the other 2. The basic element, which is common to all 3 of them, is the fact that they are grassroots museums. I mean, they are museums that were born out of the will of the people to commemorate and to give on to the next generations their message. I will speak mostly about this message and what I think, after so many years doing that and lecturing about that, what is actually the underlying and the basic message of the world we are going into, which is actually a world without survivors, and actually mostly with a world without those who lived in those communities we want to commemorate. So let's start the journey, and I want to start with describing to you what I call ground. You know, I'm having this light in my eyes. Okay. What I call ground zero. What is ground zero? Ground zero is this very critical point in time when the world after Second World War starts. What were the ingredients of that ground zero moment? The best man to describe it, in my opinion, because I'm doing all my research in the last 30 years, is the day after. It was described the best way by Yitzhak Zuckerman. Now, I don't know if you know who Yitzhak Zuckerman is. Yitzhak Zuckerman was born in Vienna. His family lived in Vienna. Actually, most of his family perished in Ponar. And Yitzhak Zuckerman was the vice commander of the Ghetto Warsaw uprising of Mordechai Anilevich. So actually, during the war, he was in Warsaw. That's why most people think that Vilna was not in Poland, in Israel. I always have to tell my students, Vilna, during the years between the two war wars, was part of Poland. Yitzhak Zuckerman wrote in his diary on the 17th of January, 1945, the following lines. And the most hoped day arrived. Suddenly, I'm shortening his remarks. Our landlord, he and Sivia, his wife, who was also among the fighters of the ghetto, the landlord came and told Sivia and me that the Soviet tanks are in the center of the city. So we went down, Sivia, me, and our dog, and we saw all the masses of the people so happy, dancing, flowers thrown all over the place. Bands are playing the music. And me, Sivia, and the dog are standing there, alone, orphaned. This was the saddest day of my life. Now, just to make you understand the depths of this sentence, I have to very shortly, in two sentences, describe to you what Yitzhak Zuckerman have been through until that day. In 1939, he escaped Warsaw, like so many others did, trying to get to the Eastern Front of fear of the Germans. The only leaders of the first rank in Polish-occupied Poland who came back were those young people who were the leaders of the youth movement, the Zionist youth movement in Poland. Yitzhak Zuckerman at that time, Mordechai Anilevich, who was the commander of the Ghetto Warsaw, was 19 years old, just to make you understand what we are speaking about. Yitzhak Zuckerman was 21. He went back, and he went back to his students in the youth movement, and he lived with them all the life of the ghetto. The ghetto was closed in April of 1940, and he lived with them until 42, until the actions. He saw them dying, and then he was part of the resistance, and then he was part of the Polish resistance, and he was hiding. And in 1941, an emissary came from Vilna to Warsaw, telling him that all his family perished in Vilna. And with all this, he kept on working. And in 1945, January, when everything was over, this was his saddest day ever. He and Sivia standing there in Warsaw, crying while all others are having the V-Day of victory. This is ground zero in the Jewish world. And this ground zero comes up. I've been doing the first ever research about the survivors of the Holocaust who came to Israel. I read, I think, thousands of testimonies. It comes back over and over again that the end of the war was the saddest and hardest day of the lives of the survivors. Not the war, the day of liberation. Each one of them felt as if he is the last Jew. From this ground zero, which is so important to define, we are here contemplating how to reenact one of the symbols of the Vilna Jewry. But of course, 70 years later. 72 already. Right? Right. From this ground zero, there could be only two reactions. One is desperation. If we are the last Jews, and if that's what happened, nothing is worth living for. And I know many people who describe their wish to suicide and their feeling, why did God did me so wrong to leave me alive while all my family perished? And the other alternative was to take yourself out of the ashes and choose life. And the great thing about the survivors was the fact that most of them, and vigorously, chose the second alternative. This is not understandable. This is not a matter of fact. This is a big, big astonishment. And from this, actually, I'm sorry. Do I need this? No. It cut my enthusiasm. And from this, actually, stem most of my presentation. What is common to all three museums and the concept behind them is, of course, first of all, that they grew up from beyond. The second is the great emphasis on education. Just to give you a notion, on the day the Kibbutz Lohamei Hagetaot, the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, was established, that was April of 1949, 6 years to the resistance. The first thing the founding fathers did was to erect a small barrack, which they called the beginning of our museum, on the same day, because they thought that life and the Holocaust should dwell together, nourish each other, that the living should nourish the memory, and the memory should empower the people. By the way, the kibbutz they established there in 1949 is one of the most successful kibbutzim in Israel and the richest. So education was the first thing, and I will give you examples in a second. The second thing, which is really amazing, was the beginning of research. They didn't have money. It was a grassroots museum. But they sent an emissary to Europe to collect evidence, to collect memories, to collect memorabilia. Miriam Novich, she went all over. The archive of the Ghetto Museum is one of the richest in the country, in the world, I think. The last thing is, of course, their worldview. I go like that? Yeah, okay. Enter? Okay. Okay, I can skip this. I want to go on because I don't want to get the note. This is very important, and I also will react to something which I reacted already yesterday, but I want to share it with you. When we speak about memory, we speak basically about two elements, personal memory and collective memory. Personal memory, and I have this goes as well. Personal memory, I will cut it short. A memory one carries with himself from an event which he personally experienced. I mean, when we hear the testimonies of the early testimonies of the survivors, they would tell you, I was there, my mother was there, they took my sister, like they viewed it in their own eyes. That is, by the way, the difference between the early testimonies and the late testimonies, when many, many witnesses are telling us what they learned over time, and they starting to be historians of the communities they present. For us today, I am using mostly the collective memory. Shared memory of a community, usually of an event which was not experienced directly by most of its members. This is the situation we are here today. The memory is transferred and shaped by different social organs. I don't want to go very deeply into that, but I want to say the following sentence concerning this. And this is something here in Vilna you should ask yourself, like we did in all three museums. what is the story about ourselves that we are telling ourselves? It's not only an historical thing. Basically, collective memory is the way a society is telling its story to itself. And it is dependent on many elements. And it is a dynamic process. The story the survivors or the different communities told themselves in 1946 is not the same they are telling themselves today in 2017. So the first thing is, in 2017, what is the story we are telling ourselves about ourselves? Now, there are three elements or venues of commemoration. The personal, which we will not go into. The communal commemoration. Different communities, the way they are commemorating their communities. And this is here a story of a community. It's not all the Lithuanian Jews. It's the Vilna Jews, although they were, I guess, the majority. The Ghetto Fighters Museum and the Sfad Hungarian Museum are not the same in this respect. The Ghetto Fighters Museum actually wished to tell the whole compass of the story of the Shoah, being the first, being the only one, and being there 3 years after everything was over. And the great thing about that, and we have films of that, is that the founding fathers actually shaped the museum, and they were those who guided in the museum. So they combined the representation with the personal story. But alas, time have passed, and one after the other, we lost those who were guiding at the museum, telling their personal stories. So the museum today is really challenged by the fact that those who told the personal stories are not there, and how do they do that? I'll say something about that at the end. And then there is the state commemoration, which of course, you know, Yad Vashem. This is a state-oriented museum. Its worldview of Yad Vashem, I have to say it, basically, formally, and decisively, their message is, our mandate is to deal with the Holocaust. The Holocaust is, according to the Israeli story, 1933, Hitler's rise to power, 1945, the end of Second World War, period. 18 years, a big group of survivors of the Holocaust in Israel, and me as the younger part of it, and I'm not so young anymore, and as you know, we are preaching Yad Vashem to deal with the heritage of the survivors. What do they have to say to other generations after the experience they've been to? And we're getting the same answer over and over again, that their mandate ends in May of 1945. But this, of course, is not the story of Lohamei Hagetaot. Just to show you as a sidekick, the two, we don't even now agree on the word Shoah. This is the English Wikipedia. I went to Wikipedia because young people read Wikipedia. They don't bother to go to the Britannica. A genocide in which approximately 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, were killed by the German military. I don't have to go on. Now you'll see the Hebrew Wikipedia. A biblical concept which is used to mark a sequence of genocidal acts executing during World War II by Nazi Germany, accomplices, the systematic annihilation of the Jewish people. You choose whatever suits you of this. Who were the source of information to create the story of the Shoah? Now, I have to say this. Fania, whom we met yesterday, the last survivor, I think, here in Vilna, of the Vilna's fate during Second World War. She knows to tell me, maybe a lot, but only about Vilna. The story of the Shoah was comprised out of hundreds of thousands of stories of survivors, each of them telling his own small story. The survivors did not know what happened in the Shoah. They knew what happened to them personally in the small places they came from. That is why I cannot say that in the definition of Shoah, it ended for the Jews in May of 1945, because to some, it ended in February of 1944, with the commencement of the Red Army towards the West. The Jewish fate is so labil during Second World War. But anyway, the ingredients of memory are, of course, first of all, the survivors who told us the story. Later on, of course, research. And the testimonies in Nuremberg. I have to say a word about that. And this is towards the getting to know the tensions of remembering what is happening. Nuremberg gave almost no evidence. Jackson, who was running the trial, said, and I quote, he said, I don't want the Jews to testify about what happened to them. Actually, they didn't understand in 1945 what the Shoah was, but he didn't want Jews to testify because he said the Jews tend all the time to exaggerate their fate. So the only ones actually who could testify from the side of the Jews were Soviet testimonies, and so Avram Sutzkover, for instance, was testifying towards the mass murders in the Soviet Union. But not under the American story, and even under the French story, who was occupied by the Germans. The story of Auschwitz was told by a Gentile woman by the name of Marie Couturier, which is very interesting testimony. You can Google it tonight. So where did we hear the testimonies of the Jews? We heard them by personal ambition to tell, by personal looking for a meaning. Why did we survive? We survived because we have to follow on the story. We have to give you what happened to us. You, the Jews in the free world, have to know what happened to us. But not only the Jews. This is a cardinal point. We want humanity to know. In a second, I'll introduce you to a document which is very, very important. I think this should be actually the motto of every new museum that is erected to commemorate a community. The Ghetto Fighters Museum, it's in the Upper Galilee. As I told you, the museum was established on the day the kibbutz was established. It's a grassroots. And their story is not ending in 1945. Actually, they wanted to tell the story of redemption. Why? Because they felt that their main aim in talking about the Holocaust is to fight desperation, because desperation means destruction. And if the Jewish people want to go on living, they have to fight desperation. They have to gain belief again in both socialism and democracy and European culture. In all of this, they lost faith. Justfully so. Okay. I want to stand in time. Zuckerman, what is the mission? This is said, it was a talk between him and Schneer, who was also an establisher of the kibbutz, and he said the following. We did not want to set just a gravestone to the dead. This is very explicit. If we went on this part, we would use bronze and marble. The museum has no bronze and marble. But we thought that our duty was to leave for the next generation the bitter lesson we learned in those harsh years in Europe. And Schneer said about Zuckerman, I knew from the start that he was aiming at building a kibbutz which will go hand in hand with the memory of the Shoah. It was clear that he did not mean a monument. I clearly understood that he had in mind a vivid enterprise, one that will be a piece in the cultural texture of the Israelis integrating into the national creation. So that means he was actually after shaping the memory, the collective memory of the Israelis. Now let me show you one more. Yitzhak wanted it to be an illustration, and this is a very important sentence, of the strengths and weakness of the Jews, but mostly as a source of empowerment. The motto of the Ghetto Fighters' House is not looking at the Shoah as a story of desperation and big sorrow, but as a source for human empowerment. This is very unlike any other museum in Israel. Most museums stretch the victimhood. The Ghetto Fighters do not do that. They fight for human morality, and they fight to show how the Shoah is actually something we learn from. And I will give you immediately something practical about that. This is the core, escaping victimhood. From the beginning, the message was turning the victim into a hero. The struggle was against the view of the victim as a paralyzed object, unable to react and act, a battle against the dehumanization of the victim as being a passive person. The transit from victim to hero is by creating the option of active resistance, which is not a mere reaction, not only by force or a gun, mere reaction to evil, but a human and moral statement of not accepting it. What I'm teaching my students and what I'm leading at the Ghetto Fighters Museum, oh, by the way, the Ghetto Fighters Museum was the first one to create, and these are 2 levels of memory, to create Yad Layeled. That is it's the only one in the world, which is a children's museum of the Holocaust, speaking about the Shoah in a completely different way. It's not Daniel's story, which we see in Washington. It's not. It's the story of the Shoah, but not with the horrors. I mean, Shoah doesn't need to have horrors. I will tell you finally a story which will show you how Shoah is not a horror. Telling them the story of the children of the Shoah, telling them the story of the old parents in the Shoah, but in a completely different way. It's the only museum of the Shoah. And what is more important, like 18 years ago, we opened in Lohamei Hagetaot the Center for Humanistic Education. The Center for Humanistic Education is a long-term educational enterprise which hosts every year 5 high schools, 5 Jewish high schools, and 5 Arab high schools, and they learn, each one, first of all, to listen. How do you listen to the plight and the horrors of the other side? How do you grasp it? How do you keep silent and understand when an Arab student in Israel says, I had the Nakba? And you grasp it, and you don't think it has anything to do with degrading your own plight. After every event, those who finish this program are asking to meet. This is one of the biggest successes. People from all over the world are coming to study it. It's actually the only place in Israel today where Arab high school students and Jewish high school students are going through a combined educational process, having also the summer vacation together. It's an amazing, I don't have the time to go into it. But I would like to leave you with the last document. 2002, no, before I read this, I want to tell you a story, 2 short stories that you will take. I know that stories are always kept in the memory. Okay. I'll give it up. Okay. It's a shame, but one? Okay. Just to show you the Shoah as an empowerment, my mother was expelled from university when she was studying medicine, and she was expelled because you know why, because she was a Jew. And when she came back from Auschwitz, she was one of those who really wanted to die. She lost her sister, her husband, not my father, first husband, her parents. And then she said, okay, I don't have the courage to kill myself. So she went to finish her studies at the University of Bratislava. The last test was an oral test, and she finished it, and there were all the dean of the medical school and all the staff, and they said, congratulations, Dr. Neuwirtova. She understood. And then she went out of the room, and it was on the second floor, and she stood at the top of the staircase, and suddenly she realized that she has nobody in the world to tell that she finished her medical studies. For me, this is the story of the Holocaust. This loneliness, but this powers of the soul to go back to studies, very difficult studies, and then standing on the top of the stairs, having nobody to tell. And the second, and that's again with coherence with what I'm telling you now, we were interviewed once on the television, and she was asked, my mother created the health services for the Bedouins in the Negev. You know Bedouins? It's they were nomad tribes in the Negev, Muslims. And she was asked, you of all people after the Holocaust, you produced the health services for the Bedouins? And she said, it's not in spite of the Shoah, it's because of the Shoah. Now, to finish, 2002, there was the last convention of Holocaust survivors, international Holocaust survivors in Israel. And they read their testimony to the next generations. It's a universalistic human document. 100,000 survivors of the Holocaust signed this document. This is the way to go about the Holocaust, bearing in mind that the two most important chapters of the Holocaust is who were the Jews who died, how did they live, who were they, what did they create, and the second, what did they do with the plight after the war? Instead of putting themselves in a vicious circle of revenge and killing, they chose life. This is the story. Just let me read to you the end of Our Living Legacy, it's called, 2002. Remember, 100,000 survivors. It's an amazing document. I will just read to you the end of it. The memory of the Shoah is contentious and dark, exposing the ugly and naked face of consummate inhumanity that threatens the very nature of stature of civilization itself. I hope you see the universalistic message. We who staggered through the valley of death only to see how our families, our communities, and our people were destroyed did not descend into despondency and despair. Rather, we struggled to extract a message of meaning and renewed purpose for our people and for all people, namely, a message of humanity, of human decency, and of human dignity. The Holocaust, which established the standard for absolute evil, is the universal heritage of all civilized people. The lessons of the Holocaust must form the cultural code for education toward humane values, democracy, human rights, tolerance and patience, and opposition to racism and totalitarian ideologies. From Har HaZikaron in Jerusalem, the words of Rabbi Hillel need to ring out loud and clear. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. Thank you.